Welcome to the Flying Octopus Podcast, offering a new perspective on Red Wings hockey, as well as all the important news from around the NHL. And now, here are your hosts, Tony Wolak, Devin Little, and Evan Sabrin.
Hey, it's Carter Bear, and you're listening to the Flying Octopus Podcast.
Welcome to episode 83 of the Flying Octopus Podcast. I'm your host, Evan Sabrin, going solo today. No corny jokes today, no cold open today, because we have a very, very special guest that I'm very excited to talk to today. National hockey writer at USA Today for 34 years. He served as the president for the Professional Hockey Writers Association for 16 years and is now the secretary. He started covering the Red Wings for the Port Times Herald in the mid-'80s. He's also a Lester Patrick Trophy winner for his contributions to the game of hockey in the United States. If you mention a major, iconic hockey moment in the last 45 years, there is a good chance this man was there to cover it. Now the editor-in-chief for Detroit Hockey Now, a Wayne, Michigan native, it's sports writer Kevin Allen. Kevin, I can't thank you enough for doing this today. Very excited to talk to you. Thanks for joining us here on the Flying Octopus Podcast.
Well, it's my pleasure, and it's always fun to talk to someone who grew up in Michigan like I did, because it was a very unique place to grow up because of the many sports fans, and of course the Lions were terrible for my entire lifetime, only in recent years. But so, there's a uniqueness that we share because we grew up, both of us grew up in Michigan.
Yeah, there's always that Detroit sports fan pain, and it looks like we're trying to deal with that now. This Tiger situation is getting really messy.
It's ugly, yeah.
I did mention that you are a Wayne Memorial grad, and I talked to you offline about going to games there at Wayne Memorial to watch Lorenzo Guess, the former Michigan State basketball player. I believe he's like strength and conditioning, does something in strength and conditioning with the team now. But I did want to start there. Growing up in Wayne, Michigan, and even through high school and going to Eastern Michigan, did you always know that this is the path that you wanted to take in your life? And the second part of that is, did you ever imagine some of the things that you would see during, this amazing career that you've had?
Yeah, I knew from an early age that that's what I wanted to do. I've told the story many times. I grew up on Wayne Road near Van Born, for those who know Michigan geography. And there was a hamburger joint called Bray's Hamburgers. And I'm dating myself. It was the 60s, early 60s. And there were 7 burgers for $1.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a pretty good deal. But I thought a better deal was I could get a Detroit Free Press for $0.10 out of the machine. And when I was very young, 6 and 7, I would put that dime in there and get that paper and devour, all the information. And I thought, boy, what a great way to making a living. And in the Wayne Youth Baseball Association, I realized early that I couldn't hit the curve, so I wasn't going to be able to play Major League Baseball. But maybe, just maybe, I could cover, Major League Baseball or hockey or football. So, yeah, I knew early, and I was fortunate to. I went to a Catholic school, and I had a nun who believed in me, who kept telling me that I could do it. And then I got to high school, and I had the great Daryl Emerson, who was my teacher there, who also told me, and, I hear stories all the time from people who said they got a lot of negativity and people saying, oh, you'll never be able to do it. I never got any of that. I got only positive feedback and people always telling me, yeah, you can do it. Just keep working at it. So I feel, fortunate. I often tell the story that, my luck is that my career happens to also be my hobby. So it never feels like work. I'm beyond age 70, but I'm still working, not because I need the money, but because I enjoy the work. I enjoy being part of, covering the NHL, which, has served me well. And as you said, I've seen a lot of great NHL moments and Olympic moments and Super Bowl moments. I've seen a lot of things, and I wouldn't have given that up for anything.
I read a funny story where one of the first days of your on the job for USA Today, where you took a phone call message or someone you were subbing in for and had a very big name on the other end of the line.
Yeah.
That kind of was your coming to moment when you're like, oh, wow, this is what I really want to do. Can you tell us a little bit about
it? It was early in the USA Today tenure. They'd only been around for a couple of years, and I was part of the Gannett chain at the Port Huron Times Herald, and I had just started to cover Detroit sports, and the Gannett news service had used my stories a little bit. So in order to keep the cost of personnel down at USA Today, they would borrow. I'll put quotes around that because it put a lot of hardship on the papers they were borrowing reporters from. But they borrowed me from the Port Huron Times-Herald for 4 months. So I show up on a Sunday, and of course, there's no desk for me. They pointed, as they said, Cindy McConkey, who was a reporter. She's off covering a USFL game. Take her desk. So I sat down, and I was only in her seat for less than a minute. The phone rings. I pick it up, and I said, Cindy McConkey's desk. And somebody said, can I speak to Cindy? And I said, no, she's out covering a USFL game. And he said, well, okay, then would you just tell her that George Steinbrenner returned her call and she can call me back and I'll give you a number. And he gave me his number. I wrote it down and I thought I turned to the guy next to me who was also on loan. And I said, we got to work at a place where George Steinbrenner returns your calls.
Did you recognize the voice like when you first heard
Yeah.
it? I mean,
I did for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, at that point he was, a huge name. And again, that was the 1980s, and it's not quite the way it is now, where there's so much, such a proliferation of media discussion, everything that things you get lost now. Well, nobody, George Steinbrenner never got lost, so everybody knew who he was. They knew that voice, and so I certainly did, and. The biggest problem I had when I got to USA Today is trying to tell myself, well, how do I distinguish myself? Because it was a paper that we wrote short stories and, some of the skills that I had used to get that high, they didn't really need me to use those skills because they didn't like or didn't want, creative, flowery writing and lead writing. If you can say something clever in 12 words, then they're happy with that. But, you can't do it in 2 paragraphs. So it was a little bit of a challenge, but I found a way to do it. It lasted a long time. And as you mentioned, I was able to cover a lot of things because even though I became a hockey writer, and even that's a story because they essentially gave me the job on a temporary basis because they couldn't find anyone. I had been hired because I had written a lot of stories about the '84 Tigers when they had won. And everyone assumed I was going to be a baseball writer, but they had lots of baseball writers and they didn't have a hockey writer at the time. And so they gave me the job on a temporary basis, and I held that job 34 years on a temporary basis.
And that's amazing. And in your 34 years, I wasn't lying when I said in the intro the things that you've seen as far as iconic hockey moments in the last 40 plus years. One of your biggest moments, and I've known this story for a long time, but I don't know all the details going into it. But in 2000, when, legendary Hockey Hall of Famer Mario Lemieux retired early from the NHL in 97, took 3.5 years off and came back to the NHL with the Penguins. You broke that story, and you were the only one to break that story. Back then, breaking stories were different. You didn't push out a tweet and have views and likes, but can you kind of walk me through that process of how that moment happened? Because it was such a big moment in hockey history. It's a moment where I remember exactly where I was in his first game where he came back, and he had a goal and 2 assists, finished second in the Hart Trophy that year. Still one of the greats, even after a 3.5-year layoff. But how did that whole process of you breaking that story? How did it come about?
Well, I mean, it was sort of multifaceted, and a lot of people thought maybe I might have gotten it from Mario himself because a lot of people knew that I knew Mario quite well. I had covered him his entire career, and he did a charity golf tournament every year, and I would go to Pittsburgh and do a story there about it, which he always appreciated. But I did it because there were always a lot of important NHL people hanging around there, so I got a lot of stories out of that. So I would always do that, and people wondered if he had tipped me off, which was not the case. And I'm not going to go into too many details, but it was somebody who was involved who had witnessed Mario working out, which led me to call someone else who would know if he was working out for a purpose. And one thing led to another. And I put 2 and 2 together, and then I needed a confirmation, and I knew the Penguins weren't going to give it to me, but I knew somebody who might give it to me, and I ended up getting it confirmed by a guy who was an unimpeachable source. And we did not do unsourced stories back then But, I think there were at that point like 8 or 9 stories that we've done, and I had 2 of them. And it was all based on when I was able to present who my sources were, they realized that, it was that I had it locked down. But what I remember most about that was, as I said, I knew Mario, and they informed him that it was out. And he said, "Who got it?" And they said, "Kevin Allen got it." And they said, "Give him an hour. Let him be out there alone for an hour and then confirm the story." And so that's what the Penguins did, which, they didn't have to do that. They could have just confirmed it. And then, my big scoop would have lasted, 2 minutes, but because it had, the ESPN had run across the bottom. We didn't have Twitter then. So, it said, according to Kevin Allen, Mario Lemieux. And so that ran for like an hour. And then the Penguins came out and confirmed the story. But I was always appreciative that he respected me enough to give me that hour alone with that scoop that he was coming back.
That's amazing. Of all the stories you broke, where does that rank up at the top? Or
Yeah,
what are some other
yeah,
you're
I know.
most
When, Eric Dehacek, who sort of did a piece on that, and Eric, of course, is also in the Hockey Hall of Fame. And when he introduced me, he talked about that it was a clean kill, as he called it. That he said, it was hard to get a clean kill in that world. And, so for that reason, I think so. I had another big one when, I was the only one who knew that in the middle of the night, the Minnesota North Stars were moving to San Jose. And so when, people in Minnesota picked up USA Today and read the next morning, your team left last night in the middle of the night. I suggest everyone just go to Wikipedia and sort it out. But, essentially, the Gunn brothers were bringing the team from Minnesota, and they ended up having a dispersal draft where they split the 2 teams up, and then, they made San Jose an expansion team. So it was a very complicated deal. But, that it looked like the Minnesota North Stars would no longer exist. And then obviously they did exist, and then they ended up in Dallas after that.
That's a crazy story. I do want to shift gears here for a second and talk about the news that we saw yesterday. I know it's a somber topic, but
Yeah.
the passing of Claude Lemieux yesterday, which I think shocked a lot of people in the hockey world. I'm not going to go into details about that, but Claude Lemieux, love him or hate him, he was a playoff hero, an agitator. Come playoff time, he was the guy that every team in the NHL would love to have on their playoff roster. When I look back at my lifetime and think about Detroit sports, he's always going to be the guy that people considered as villain number one. Now, recently we've seen the shows come out, Unrivaled, the ESPN documentary they did with Darren McCarty and Claude, and kind of see how they patched fences, and they kind of found a mutual respect for each other. And Darren came out yesterday and had some really nice things to say about the kind of person that Claude Lemieux was off the ice. I think sometimes people forget too that, he's Moritz Seider's agent too. So Claude Lemieux's legacy with the Red Wings will forever be entwined as far as, those Avs Red Wings rivalries in the 90s and so on. You co-authored a book with Darren called My Last Fight, The True Story of a Hockey Rock Star. Is there anything in there or something from that or something from your personal experience? I know you've covered Claude probably more times than you can count on your hands. Is there something you can tell us about Claude off the ice and on the kind of person that he was?
Yeah, I mean, I can, and I've had discussions today with some of my friends about this, and they all had similar experiences. In the hockey world, it was pretty consistent that a lot of the toughest players that you dealt with in terms of the way they performed on the ice turned out to be some of the nicest men off the ice. I mean, I also wrote a book with Stu Grimson, who was a heck of a fighter, but he's an intellectual, a lawyer, he's cerebral, and he's just the last guy you would expect to be brawling in an NHL thing. And Bob Probert was another one. Bob Probert, didn't love fighting, like Joey Kosher, his buddy, really liked it. Like he was not only a good fighter, but he liked fighting. Bob didn't particularly like it. Like you usually had to hit him 2 or 3 times before he'd get into it. But once he got into it, he was the best at it. And so, we all had experiences, and Claude Lemieux was in that boat. Like, he was an ornery cuss on the ice, and he was the villain, and he played the villain well. And, but when you talk to him, like, he didn't seem like that guy, he just really didn't. And I wouldn't say that I knew him as well as I knew some other players, but you were right. I probably interviewed him a dozen times during the playoffs and everything else. And I got to the point where I really liked him. He was always helpful. He always had something to say. And, he didn't try to be controversial, but he was always colorful when he spoke. So I really enjoyed that. And then when I did the book, I found it very enlightening that Darren really wanted to talk about Claude Lemieux. And, one of the themes of the book is Darren, of course, had a hard time. He blew all the money that he earned playing hockey, and he needed revenue streams. And one of the ways he could do it was to do signings with Claude Lemieux. And so he would ask Claude, will you come to Detroit and sign everything for me? And he says, he says, and I'm going to get you 10,000. Well, Claude didn't need the money. He really didn't, but he did it. And in the book, Darren pointed out that Claude never kept any of the money. He just would always donate it to charity. When he did it, he never took the money from all the things that he signed when he would come and do those signings with Darren McCarty.
Really?
Didn't need the money, but my theory is, and Darren, tends to agree with it. He did it because he wanted to help Darren McCarty. He didn't need to do that. His popularity, his place in the game was all well established. So, I think there is something about, Claude Lemieux. And, when you talk to his teammates, Ken Danico today was on NHL Network and, was tearing up about, what a great guy Pepe, that's what they called him, Pepe was. And, I think people felt that way no matter where he was.
That is a really great story. I'm curious, as someone who covered that era of Red Wings hockey for USA Today and being around that rivalry, can you explain to like Red Wings fans who can't really remember the good times because it feels like it was so long ago, but just the energy in the city of Detroit back then, that the Colorado Avalanche, the Red Wings battling it out,
Yeah.
year after year. Like, talk to me about that time there you spent covering that part of the Red Wings era.
Yeah, I mean, people have, talk about the Boston Bruins and Montreal Canadiens as being an unbelievable rivalry dating back to the original six. But, I remember that from being a kid, but I didn't know it as a writer. So it's hard for me to compare those two. But I think the Colorado-Detroit rivalry, because of its intensity, because of the incidents, there was the Mark Crawford and Scotty Bowman getting into it. And of course, we had the Claude Lemieux situation. We had the goalie fights. I just don't think there was another rivalry like it. I mean, the sense of anticipation when those two teams played, it was hard to describe. I mean, and, it was just when talk radio was getting fired up and it was starting to really sort of take over the sports scene in a lot of major cities. So there was always a lot of discussion on it, and the personalities, and the best story that I think sums up like how heated it was is that when Peter Forsberg was a free agent at some point, and of course people had asked him, the Red Wings are a great team, right? Would you consider going over there? And he said basically, I would never play for the Red Wings. I quit the NHL before I played for the Red Wings. I mean, that's how he felt about it. I mean, and Peter was a great guy, still's a great guy, but he just felt that rivalry, like he just did not want to have any association with that team in red. And, and most of the guys, felt that way. And, the fan bases, of course. And I think, today, I think the NHL misses that rivalry. They miss, having rivalries like that. I mean, we have them, they pop up, but they disappear. But that one held on for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, those are just the iconic memories that, that I was so glad that I got to be a part of and be around back in the 90s. I do want to switch to today's Red Wings, which is, again, going back to a more somber subject. This week, and I mentioned that you're the editor-in-chief for Detroit Hockey Now, you tweeted out that from a lot of the pending unrestricted free agents that the Red Wings are going to have to decide on coming up here, you think they're only bringing Patrick Kane back and they're going to, inject more youth into the lineup. Can you elaborate a little bit on that as far as?
Yeah, for sure. We're not getting any of that information from the Red Wings management. I mean, for those who don't know on the national level who are listening to this, I'm more likely to get the nuclear codes from President Donald Trump than I am to get good information from Steve Yzerman. Like, he just is very guarded on his strategy and what he's up to. But all indications are that the only guy they really want to have come back is Patrick Kane. So, there's no room for Cam Talbot because they have two young goalies that and Sebastian Cossa and Michael Ostava, who, one of them is going to end up as the backup goalie next year to Gibson. So he's not coming back. Van Riemsdyk is older. They liked him for a while, but he only got one goal down the stretch, and they need more goals. So I don't see him coming back as well. And David Perron didn't work out very well. So they're just none of the UFAs really distinguished themselves, and even Eric Gustafsson, who they really appreciated going down and playing for the Grand Rapids Griffins and helping them out. He'll play in the NHL next season. I'm sure of that. He had a really nice season in Grand Rapids, but it won't be with the Red Wings. So, and sooner or later, you got to bring these guys up. Like Michael Brandsegg-Nygaard has, like I wrote today that he seems to be in a 4-part audition. He played in the regular season down in Grand Rapids. He got 20 goals. He was 8 points in 8 games in the playoffs. He's looked good. He's a physical player and a goal scorer. He won the World Championships. He's been over there 3 games. He scored an overtime goal. He had a 2-goal game. He had a primary assist in a 2-0 win. And then the final step will be in the training camp, and that's when he'll have to prove. But you got to have room for him. You got to make room so that he can play. Carter Mazur is another young player who, like Brandsegg-Nygaard, is a hitter. He's a hitter. He can score some goals, but he also will create some havoc. Well, you got to have room for him, and neither of these. Carter Mazur, you're going to have to. He can't go back to Grand Rapids without going through waivers, and as well. And that's been one of the problems, is that historically, dating back to Ken Holland, is they wait too long, and then they don't really have a real handle on where these guys can play and how effective they can be. And then by then waivers are required and they have to keep them. So next year, I wouldn't be shocked that next year you wouldn't see a third line that looks like Brandsegg-Nygaard, Carter Mazur, maybe Marco Kasper, maybe even Amadeus Lombardi, who is a smaller player who scores goals at the AHL level, but they like him a lot, so maybe he'll be up as well. Because Steve Yzerman has said that he needs 2 major changes. He needs them to score more goals. That's crucial, and that's going to be hard because it's a very, very lukewarm UFA market, and there's certainly no centers and very few big goal scorers, so it's going to be hard to get that. But the other thing he wants to do is be harder to play against. And, you're not going to be able to do that with the personnel they have. That's why it's important that Brandsegg-Nygaard and Mazur, make that team, because, they'll be among the top 3 hitters on the team next year just by being on the team, because, that's just part of their game.
You mentioned Ken Holland, and it's kind of part of my next question. We talk a lot about in this show about how the Red Wings got here. I think for me, this 10-year playoff drought is the perfect storm of so many bad ingredients. A lot of people say, when Steve Yzerman took over, the cupboard was bare as far as prospects. I look at, the last 3 or 4 drafts where Ken Holland's team was making the picks, and you see guys that they missed on badly. You talk about guys like Zadina, Dennis Chalowski, Michael Rasmussen, Evgeny Svechnikov. The list could go on. But I think there's more to that story, in part that, Steve Yzerman's not 100% not accountable, is accountable too for for how long this rebuild has taken. And I come from that the fact that I think there's been problems with free agents. As far as bringing players to Detroit, it's a much different game nowadays with players having a little more freedom to kind of maybe choose where they want to play. Detroit hasn't been a good team geographically. It's not a go-to spot for some of these guys who want to play in Vegas or in Los Angeles or in warm weather cities. But I also think there's been some questionable decisions, like I said, in free agency, but there's also been some ones in the draft as well. Would you agree that it's a combination of all of that that's kind of led to this 10-year playoff drought for Hockeytown?
Yeah, I mean, I was a history, had a minor in history in college, and one of the things that we learned about was how World War One started, and it wasn't one thing; it was a collection of things that led to that point. And I always think about that because that's what's happened to the Red Wings. Mr. Ilitch, who was a great owner, the Ilitch family has been great owners. He wanted to maintain the playoff streak. And because of that, the Red Wings did some things they shouldn't have done. Like they, kept guys longer than they should have because they needed them to help getting the playoffs. I mean, at the end, Datsuk and Zetterberg, they probably should have been looking to replace them, but they needed them to get in the playoffs, and they didn't, do any of that. Because they were in the playoffs every year, they didn't pick early in the draft, which means they didn't get players. I mean, one of the things that never gets discussed enough, and it's starting to come out now, but it is, in my opinion, impossible to build through the draft. Like, when you're picking, and now the statistics that now that we have AI, you can look it up now. Like in the first round, you got an 80% chance, 80%, if you're picking in the first 15 picks, of getting a player who will play in the league 200 games. 80%. Right. That's with the 15 picks. In the second half of the first round, it's 40% for first round picks. Now, you can't, if you're picking that's why you don't want to trade your top 15 pick, but everybody will trade their 21st, 22nd, 23rd, and 24th. The second round, which is where the Red Wings picked this year, I just wrote this today. You can look at my story. In the second round, 23 to 34% chance of getting a player that will play 200. That's all. That's the minimum, like 200 games in there. And then after that, you're in the single digits to get that. Each team, and this has been going on for a long time, gets an average of 1.9 players, not stars, players who out of each draft. So, people now think, well, the 5-year plan. Well, if everything goes well, you get like 9 players in 5 years, and all of them won't be ready. The guy that was drafted in the 5th year isn't going to be ready in that 5th year as well. So it takes longer to develop them as well. So
my point that I've been arguing is that, yes, I get how hard it is to project an 18-year-old. It's extremely difficult. But at the same time, I feel like a lot of these scouts, I mean, technically their job is to project what these things are. And the ones who are better at projections are the teams that, we see with more success. You look at teams like the Montreal Canadiens. You look at even a different format what the Vegas Golden Knights have done as far as just, blowing through draft picks and trading those into, star quality players. What I think about is that you haven't seen the Red Wings make a lot of changes within the organization up at the top level, from amateur scouting and pro scouting. Basically, since Yzerman's been here, it looks like there's not going to be any changes this summer. What do you say to that? Do you think that there should be more changes as far as the front office, as far as the scouting and the staff there?
Yeah, I think so. But, I think we need to back up a little bit, and I need to dispute what you just said a little bit. There was a guy, and I wish I had more details, but it's out there if you want to do a little research. But there was a guy at an Ivy League school that did a study on the NHL drafts, and he had some of the statistics that I just started. He looked at it for 30 years. He'd had a 30-year study on the draft. And, one of the things he pointed out, that he said, one of the fallacies, he said, everybody told me, because he said he didn't know. He was a math guy. He didn't know anything about hockey. And he said, all the hockey people said, but there's some people that are really good at it. He goes, okay, all right. He said, well, I can work with that. And, I can do the sort of figure out how that works. And then when he was done, that didn't prove to be the case. As he said, all we have is a randomness. He said, some teams are good for a while, and then they go south, and so what that told him is it's not that they're good. They just got lucky. They threw their darts and their darts landed well. Like he said, there's just a lot of guesswork in dealing with 18-year-old, people. And he goes, that, makes it a little bit harder. Now, one of the things we didn't talk about is what do we know about the Montreal Canadiens draft picks? They got a lot of guys early in the pick, which the Red Wings have never had any lottery luck too. And that's hurt them, because if you could pick in the first 5 picks, you got like a 95% chance of getting a star. Like that's been consistent. Now, you don't always, there have been some things. So the Red Wings have had that, and that's played a role in it. Now, could they do better? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, do I think like there's, certain things that they do that I wish they would do better? Like, why haven't they gone after some bigger players in the draft? There's no explanation for that. They take the best available player. But I do think, in this league, you got to have some big players. They don't have big players. And I think they haven't worked hard enough to balance out having enough centers. When you look at their prospect list, they don't have centers that are coming. Danielson, is there, but can he be in the top 6? I'm not sure. I'm not sure we know, not at this point. So, and then I'm glad you brought up about Dallas. I ran into George McPhee in an elevator, and I asked him, I said, why do you hate the draft, George? And he laughed. He goes, well, we don't hate the draft. He said, but we believe that draft picks need to be utilized for other reasons than taking players. We find you get more value from them by moving them out and bringing in players now. And he goes, I think the Florida Panthers share that thinking as well. And it's true. I mean, you look at those 2 teams, they have moved out plenty of their draft picks, and, look how successful they've been because of that. I think that's a model. You probably need a hybrid, a little bit of both, but I don't think the Red Wings have done a good job in terms of their free agent signings. And some of that, of course, is, and you brought it up, nobody wants to come and play for Detroit. Not now. I mean, it used to be in the old days, everybody wanted to play for them. Not now. It's harder to recruit. And now, like, everybody keeps their top players. Like, it's just a few. And, this year, not only is there a limited number of desirable players, but everybody's got money. The caps have gone up. So you're competing. You're going to have to overpay to get, even mediocre players.
Yeah, I always feel like the Red Wings were never at the right place at the right time when it came to the draft these last 10 years. You have guys like, obviously there was major hits in Sider. You look at the 3 guys selected in front of Lucas Raymond, and you can make an easy case that he could have been the 2nd overall pick behind Stützle. Simon Evanson, love him as a player. I think some people think the jury's still kind of out on him. You talk about Marco Kasper, who kind of felt regressed, especially from an offensive standpoint this past season. Jury, again, still out on Nate Danielson. We've heard all these Kosa trade rumors lately, but I'm looking at this past season. Last season, I really felt like this team was going to struggle just because of the fact that, you introduced 3 rookies into a lineup on opening night with Finney, ASP, MBN. Red Wings got off to a pretty good start. And obviously, we saw where they were in late January. But then March comes around, and it feels like it keeps happening and happening again. Obviously, it has. But what can you say about the 2026-27 Red Wings going forward? Do you think this is going to be another year of growing pains? Because we just talked about the new players that they're going to introduce into the lineup. They're going to bring in more younger players this following season. Basically, they have to for waiver purposes. What do you project for the 2026-27 Red Wings?
Well, I think more of the same in terms of, could they have made the playoffs this year? Yeah, they could have, but they didn't. They folded again. They didn't play well when it really mattered. And I think that's what we're going to see next year. can they figure out a way to get more goals? Because if they had more goals last year, they would have done better. I mean, they're 5-on-5 scoring, 30th in the NHL. I mean, that's just atrocious. That's the name of the game. It's 5-on-5 scoring. And so I think if they can get some secondary scoring, they can, make another run at it, but it's not going to be better. It's still going to be, can they hang on? They'll be scrapping for wins and in February and March. And, Gibson, they're counting on Gibson being as good as he was this year. And, can he do that? It's goalies are somewhat like a major league pitchers. Like, we know who the good ones are, but whether they win 12 games or 17 or 18 varies from year to year. And the same is true with goalies. Like, we know we can identify who our the credible goalies are, but are they going to win, 28 games, 30 games? What are they going to do? You don't know. So, if Gibson has another exceptional season, if their youngsters step up, if DeBrincat and Lucas Raymond and Larkin play as well as they have, if Patrick Kane can stay healthy, but again, they're not going to suddenly, win the Atlantic Division. They're just not. Like, this is not a team. I mean, Montreal has been able to pick so early in the draft that they have such difference makers. Now, saying that, they hit on Cole Caulfield when a lot of teams passed on him. So I'm giving them credit for that. They saw that. But they have, most of the fact that they have these great draft picks is saying that they've been drafting really early, where the Red Wings never had lottery luck. So, and if you're a Red Wing fan, you think that's a conspiracy, but
Yeah,
that's a topic for another day. So
the one that bothers me the most is Lane Hudson going at 64th overall. A lot of teams missed on him too, and you can't
well, it's
value the impact he has on that team.
Yeah, for sure. And then his first point in the NHL was against the Red Wings too.
Yep. Of course, they always are.
Yeah. And then, Washington ends up with, Washington ends up with his brother as well. So, yeah. And I saw there's a player in the Quebec League that is projected to go like in the bottom of the first round. And I saw that one of the scouts compared him to Lane Hudson. And I thought, well, I can see why. I mean, they're going to take him if you're being compared to him, because he's such a difference maker, to say the least. So,
if you had to guess this summer, is Steve Yzerman feeling that much pressure that you think he would go out and make a big move for a star player?
Well, he wants to make a big move, but I don't think there's one available to him. I mean, and I've talked to, I like to talk to our readers, and, they email me and then they say, we just need to make a big move. Like, we got to move Larkin. I said, well, tell me what kind of move that you think by trading Larkin that will make him, make the team better. And he goes, well, you trade him for, 2 scorers. And I said, no, that's not really how it works. That isn't how it works. So I don't know what the big move, if you're asking me, is he willing to move prospects to get real players? The answer is yes. I'm sure of that. I'm confident. I mean, we've asked him that, he would like to do that, but, it's hard to turn prospects into players. So I don't know what he can do. Would somebody want Ransig Nygaard? Yes, for sure they would. And, especially, or, Mazer or Carter Bear, they would want them, but they're not giving up, Pasternak to get, 2 of those. Yeah. So we're, I don't know where he goes. I mean, I really don't. The days of, I was talking to my colleague, Bob Duff, and in the old days, used to trade, the Boston would trade their left wing to Detroit for Detroit's left wing. But, there was only 6 left wings in the league, number 1 left wing. So, at worst, you were getting the 6th best, wing in the thing in the league. And it's just, it's just different now. Those days are gone. And, most of those trades where they trade draft picks and everything happen, when the team is stressed because the guy's going to walk away as a free agent and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I don't know what he's can do. I wish I could be more helpful, but I mean, I do think it does make sense to me that he really needs to try to get some players that are harder to play against. And, some of them will be younger, but, I know they're interested in McCarron for sure. He's a Michigan native, and I think that would be a good acquisition if they can do that. He could score 10 or 11 goals playing on the fourth line, win some faceoffs, and the Red Wings would be harder to play against because he's a miserable guy to have to deal with. So,
Yeah, I've seen a lot
that
of
would
people.
help the team, but they're not going to transform overnight. One of my colleague, Bob Duff, he believes the mistake the Red Wings made, and he may not be wrong on this, was Steve tried too early to make the playoffs. He should have let him suffer a little bit longer, try to get, the difference makers, those, when you're picking in the second and third slots, getting those star players, like if he'd have done it 2 more years and, because they got into the 15 ranks too early, that's was Bob's theory. And he may not be wrong on that. You got to suffer for a while to get that. But, now
That's the way it goes.
yeah, now they're kind of in a bad spot. And, no one anticipated that the salary cap was going to go up and that everybody in the world was going to have money to spend and that everybody would use some of that money to re-sign all of their players. Like, like people are talking about some of the guys that are available now, like McMahon. Like Seattle may still re-sign him. And, so he may not even be available. And even if he is available, will he want to come to Detroit? I don't know. So
We've seen the same with Elias Pettersson, talking about a move, possibly him, maybe getting him at a
yeah,
cheaper
I
rate.
don't see a Pettersson move because and I know that he is not an Yzerman player. So, like Yzerman loves guys who compete. And, that's why he loves Patrick Kane. Has Patrick Kane lost a step? For sure. Does he get injured? Yes. But does he give you everything he asks? For sure. And, they don't have anybody on the team that can gain the offensive zone the way that Patrick Kane can. They need him. If he doesn't re-sign with them, it will be devastating because now all of a sudden, instead of needing one 30-goal scorer, now you need 2 guys for your top 6. And you're going to have a hard time finding one. Then you're going to have to get 2. Wow. If they don't get him, Branson Nygaard might have to play on the second line. So
that's going to be really interesting to see how they juggle that this summer and what happens in the next month, considering the draft and free agency. I have one last question for you.
Yeah.
And I can't thank you enough for your time today, Kevin. This is a real treat for us. You mentioned your colleague, Bob Duff. I want to talk about another one of your colleagues, and that's the great Doc Emrick. I know you co-authored 2020 autobiography called Off Mike, How a Kid from Basketball Crazy Indiana Became America's NHL Voice. Doc is a legend. He's the legend when you think of the greatest hockey broadcasters, when you think to that voice calling finals games. He was bigger than life, I would say. What can you tell us about Doc, the kind of person he is? Because he's just someone that I think a lot of people gravitate towards too when you talk about some of the game's greatest voices.
Yeah, I mean, I've known him a long time. We both came through Port Huron, although we were not there at the same time. He was the voice of the Port Huron Flags. And then, after he left, a couple years later, I showed up in Port Huron. And, when I would run into him in the NHL, we would compare notes about our life and times in Port Huron. Now, he lived there and still lives in the area, in the Port Huron area. But, Doc, for those who are familiar with Detroit sports lore, Mike Emrick is the Ernie Harwell of hockey. He's just a gifted broadcaster, cerebral, articulate, glib, but he's also the kindest man you're ever going to meet. And I always tell the story of I had to do a story on religion in baseball, and Ernie says, meet me at my hotel room. And he was in Toronto. And so I went to his hotel room and I knocked on the door, and this guy comes in. He was wearing a t-shirt and jeans and no socks and shoes. He says, come on in, Kevin, let's talk about religion in baseball. And that's also, Mike wouldn't come barefooted, but that's essentially Mike's attitude as well. He's just kind. He's always got, a minute or two. He's a dog lover as well. And, I like everything about him and his wife. It's hard to believe, but he's now almost 80 now. So I still talk to him quite regularly, and he's still, current. He could still broadcast a game if you needed him to. He's still sharp as can be. So he's a good man. My favorite story from the book was one that him and I talked about together. We were talking about comparing notes. When I left Eastern Michigan University, I went to Casa Grande, Arizona. It was my first job after college. And I had offers from Sun Valley, Idaho for $160 and a little weekly paper outside of Orlando, Florida for $170. And I went for the money. I took 180 to go to Casa Grande. And when Mike Emrick went to Port Huron, he went there for 165 a week. And we were comparing notes, and Mike looked at me and he said, Kevin, but he said the jokes was on them because you and I would have done it for nothing. And he's not wrong.
That's a great story. Great story. Kevin, I can't thank you enough for coming on today. Like I said, this was very special for me. Talked to my father earlier this week, told him about that we would be meeting with you. And he kind of reminded me of a time back in Plymouth, Michigan, when I was younger, when people still read newspapers, and we would go to this diner. It was called Bodie's. It was downtown Plymouth by the railroad tracks. And you would go in there, and back then people would eat their breakfast and they'd read their newspaper. And then you'd leave your newspaper for like the next group of people coming in, and then they grab your sports section. So that's where I'd grab my USA Today's and read your stuff. So it's kind of great that it's all come full circle for us. And my dad really loved hearing about that. So again, thank you so much for doing this. Now he's the editor-in-chief for Detroit Hockey Now. Check out his work. You can follow him on Twitter at @KevinAllen. Great to talk to you. And I hope we could do this again sometime down the road.
I would love to do it. Anytime you want to, break down the league and maybe we go going into the playoffs or at the start of the season, I'm happy to do it. And I'm always happy to, help you dissect what's going on with the Red Wings, because it's a challenging thing. I mean, you don't get much from Steve in terms of, help. He really does. He's guarded with his information, but that makes it fun as well. So
I'm really looking forward to this upcoming summer and the next season. So thanks again, Kevin. I really appreciate it.
All right. See you later.
Thanks for listening to the Flying Octopus Podcast. Follow us on YouTube at the Flying Octopus channel and Twitter at Flying Octopod.